Welcome back to Mission 150. I'm David Trim. I'm Director of Archives, Statistics and Research for the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
And I'm Sam Nevis, Associate Director of Communication for the World Church.
Today we're joined by Dr. Michael Sakupa. Since 2016, Dr. Sakupa has been Associate Director of the Ellen G. White Estate based in Silver Spring, Maryland. But he formerly taught theology and church history at Helderberg College in South Africa. Michael, welcome to Mission 150.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here in this important 150th anniversary of missions.
Michael, we talked with you in our previous episode about how the Adventist mission came to South Africa. Of course, it didn't stop in South Africa. It started to go further north into the territories north of that. Where did Adventist missionaries go next after they went to what today is South Africa? And we should just explain again, when they arrived, there was no country of South Africa. That dates after the Anglo-Boer War. So in the 1880s and 1890s, there are British colonies, there are independent Afrikaner republics, and then north of that you have vast territories that are still ruled over by indigenous black African rulers. Taking South Africa as a region, and what today we would call the Union of South Africa, where did they go after South Africa?
I think there were a number of factors that led to that decision of where to go. Because as the territory of South Africa was expanding and also still included many parts of Southern Africa, there was opportunity to explore taking the message further, and this time it went to southern Rhodesia.
Michael, Rhodesia is a word that is a name that will be familiar to some of our older viewers and listeners. Mm-hmm. To our younger viewers and listeners, they'll be saying, where is Rhodesia? So please tell us what Rhodesia was and what modern countries it included.
Okay, Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia is the current Zimbabwe. And northern Rhodesia would be Zambia today.
So that would be huge.
You have a number of Southern Africa countries that are surrounding that territory, including Botswana. You have Malawi, you have Mozambique. All these are bordering Zimbabwe. So it's a landlocked country that is bordering quite a number of countries. And there was, indigenous rule of kings and so on, but there was also a spreading of colonial rule as well.
Right. And so Rhodesia actually is an example of private enterprise empire building, because Cecil Rhodes, who makes a fortune from diamonds in South Africa and becomes the great imperial builder of the British Empire in Southern Africa, decides to expand north. Mm-hmm. And being a modest man, once he's conquered this absolutely vast territory, he names it after himself. Rhodes becomes Rhodesia. Yes. So, it's a modest man who names such a vast territory after himself, but that was what Cecil Rhodes was like. Right. So this is, in the 1890s, this has just been acquired by the British through conquest, through quite bloody wars against the Ndebele and other peoples. Right. So here you have this vast territory to the north of South Africa. How did Adventist missionaries come to go into what was then southern Rhodesia and today is the country of Zimbabwe? How did Adventist missionaries come to go there?
There was some contact between A.T. Robinson, and Cecil Rhodes.
So just to remind our listeners and viewers from last week, Asa Robinson was the leader of the Adventist mission in Southern Africa.
At the time, yes. So he contacts Rhodes and
Which Rhodes? The rich guy?
Cecil Rhodes, the rich guy. John Cecil Rhodes.
Okay.
And he wants land for mission up north, especially in southern Rhodesia, which is known as Zimbabwe today.
So this is really visionary, because this is a territory that's only just come under British rule, and you've already got Robinson contacting Rhodes and saying, we want to send missionaries there. So that's pretty visionary, wouldn't you say?
Yes, and it seems it was not just his own vision, but it was something that was collaborative, because we have a wealthy Peter Wessels involved in this, and
we
they're
talked
gathering funds.
We talked about Peter Wessels last week, of
Yes.
course, one of the men who appeals to the General Conference to send missionaries to South
Right.
Africa, and is quite prosperous and affluent.
Yes.
And is a leading layman in the church.
So they are gathering funds to finance this endeavor, and they are requesting for land. So John Cecil Rhodes instructs Jameson, who was under him, to provide the land that is required or is requested.
So there's an interesting intersection here with wider history that perhaps we can draw to the attention of our viewers and listeners. Leander Starr Jameson, who is Rhodes's agent in Rhodesia, of course, later becomes infamous because he leads an attempted rebellion in the Afrikaner republics, which becomes one of the causes of the Anglo-Boer War. So Jameson is somebody who is significant in the wider history of South Africa. But was he not also a doctor who had treated Peter Wessels?
Yes.
So there was
this connection there as well.
So there was an old connection between Jameson and Peter Wessels.
Peter Wessels.
Right.
So
Fascinating stuff. Like the history of Adventism has a lot. We did not influence it in any way, but there are connections there.
Right. And Michael, can I raise with you? Isn't this a little disquieting? After all, you've got the British. And I'm British myself, but one can recognize the faults of one's ancestors. The British had just conquered this territory. Rhodes had raised effectively a private army. The British government didn't annex Rhodesia itself, which is why it gets called Rhodesia, because Rhodes founds this entity called the British South African Company, and it raises its own private army. But he takes it for Britain. It's just conquered this vast territory through a very bloody campaign with a lot of casualties amongst the indigenous Matabele or Ndebele people. This is an example of colonialism and imperialism at its most brutal. And here we have Adventists seeming to be complicit in colonialism by saying to the new imperial masters, give us the territory, over whatever the wishes might be of the local people. Is there anything that Adventists should feel embarrassed about here?
Well, I think in the interest of mission, one looks at the dynamics before this, and looking at South Rhodesia before this land was seized, you would find that it was a land that had kings, that was prosperous. They had minerals. They had all kinds of resources. They were trading with Indonesians, with Mozambicans. They were trading with people, Swahili-speaking people from the up north. So the history of this area is very rich in terms of a well-established kingdom. But it was not easy to access with the gospel. And so this change opens up this opportunity where now missionaries can be received. And so one finds the situation really challenging, where you have a colonial power taking over, and then the Adventist church moves in and receives benefits from, you know.
This is a very common theme in mission, actually, in all of Christian mission, where the interests of either governments or kingdoms or nations or business align with Christian evangelistic efforts.
Right.
So to the degree that they do align. At the same time, you often have missionaries, even well before Adventism, who are constantly the pain of empire.
Yes.
Because they're constantly pointing out the failures of empire. They're constantly pointing out everything that they're doing wrong. So it's to some degree, there is some alignment of their motivations.
Yes.
But on the other hand, they're constantly butting heads because of their values.
That's a really good point, Sam, and it's true. missionaries are often complicit with colonial powers, but then they also become often its harshest critics.
Immediately, almost.
And I think what we can say, Michael, is, Adventists tend to see providentialist explanations in a lot of places, many of which I believe, some of which I'm not so sure about. Sometimes we see it in retrospect, and we perhaps align things that aren't there. What I would say is I don't believe that God willed or purposed the conquest of Zimbabwe in this brutal way by the British South Africa Company, but God and the Seventh-day Adventist Church were willing to make the most of the opportunity that it presented. God works through humans and their sins and their things that probably appall our Father in heaven, but God works through that and says, right, what can be done to maximize the opportunity?
We see this in our own lives. How many of us have gone through some kind of tragedy, be it an accident or the result of someone's malevolence against us?
Yeah.
And then God takes that and makes the most of it in our own lives.
Yes.
I think that's usually the case. But Wessels, or was it Wessels that writes the letter? Robinson.
Van Druten.
No, to Rhodes.
To Rhodes. It was Robinson.
Okay, so Robinson writes, he sees the opportunity and says, hey, there may be
Wessels is involved as well.
Wessels is involved as well. He's involved in the funding of the new mission that is being envisioned. And he travels to South Rhodesia, known as Zimbabwe today, with Sparrow, and also other
What was
people.
Sparrow's first name?
Peter Sparrow.
Peter Sparrow. And actually, the Sparrows, there's a whole family of Sparrows who are very involved. I know there's a Chris Sparrow who's involved as well.
Yes.
So the Sparrows become a leading family in Adventist mission in Southern Africa.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Michael, just to get from Cape Town to Kimberley or to Pretoria or Johannesburg is a journey of several days on a train. Mm-hmm. There's no railway yet that goes up to Bulawayo, which is where they go still exists today. Of course, today is a modern city. What does it take to send a party of missionaries from the northern part of southern Africa to Bulawayo? You said Wessels is one of those who travels. How many people go up, and what sort of time span are we talking about to actually get there?
Well, we're talking 700 miles on ox wagons.
Wow.
So
you can imagine how long.
This is sort of like American pioneers going across west with ox carts and covered wagons, but you're having to travel 700 miles.
Mm-hmm. So they take this trip,
and that's just
to explore.
That's from where? From Kimberley?
This is actually, they take a train from Cape Town to Vryburg in South Africa, which is up north, and then from there they take the wagons, ox wagons,
another 700
miles to South Rhodesia, where this site was.
And how many missionaries went in that first party?
We know two names, Wessels and Sparrow, but the other people that were in the party are not really mentioned by name.
Would some of those have been black Africans?
Probably not. I would not think there were some black Africans at this time, because remember, they were still focused on developing the work in South Africa at this time. Right. And what is interesting, though, is that I was invited to come and preach in Zimbabwe. And during the preparations, I was told I'll be speaking to the Xhosa people, which is a tribe from South Africa. And I wondered, are there Xhosa-speaking people in Zimbabwe? And they told me yes. And in interviewing these families, they told me how they were brought into South Rhodesia back then, their ancestors at least, were brought in by Cecil Rhodes. And the main...
To be servants, perhaps?
No. They were teachers.
As teachers?
They were, merchants. So they were there to bring development into Rhodesia, South Rhodesia.
In the history of Brazil that I'm more familiar with, the Portuguese had to fill the land and make it productive and create these communities. Otherwise, they would have lost the land to the surrounding nations, or the Spanish at least.
Yes.
So I'm seeing some of those themes of okay, you conquered the land, but in order to keep it, you need to develop it, and you need to have people that consider it a home.
Right. But the majority speaking people in Zimbabwe are the Ndebele
Ndebele and Shona.
and Shona.
Yes. So Shona land was a big area, and also you have in Bulawayo, where the work begins, is mostly Ndebele.
Right.
That's where Solusi is, about 35 miles from Bulawayo.
So vessels and this party and Sparrow trek north with their ox wagons, a journey which must have taken them many, many days, many weeks in fact. And then they get to Bulawayo, which is where Dr. Jameson, Cecil Rhodes' colonial agent, is.
Yes.
What happens next?
And then they are given this 12,000 acre land.
But there's a great story here, if I recall, that they actually, Vessels goes into Jameson and starts and gives him Rhodes's letter, and he starts talking about what they want.
Right.
And if I remember correctly, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong. Jameson sort of says, well, what do you want? And Vessels says, well, what has Rhodes told you? And he says, I've told you to give as much land as you want. Rhodes has written this letter, and Vessels has carried it the whole way, of course, but it's sealed. You don't want to mess with the most important man's mail. So he gives it to Jameson and discovers that Rhodes has actually instructed Jameson to give the Adventists as much land as they want. And so at that point, Vessels, he could have been thinking small.
Yes.
He could have been timid, he could have been a little, but instead God actually prompts him perhaps to think big, doesn't he? So it's 12,000 acres
of land. And unfortunately, when this offer is given, the information is sent to the General Conference. Should we receive this gift or grant of land? And the response is very challenging, because there is controversy over this.
Because it's partly because this is, Adventists are very concerned about separation of church and state.
Yes.
And here they are receiving land from the new British state that's been set up. So tell us more about that controversy.
So this controversy is basically on the issue whether they should receive this or not. Whether we are in principle when it comes to church and state matters. So discussions go both ways, and Ellen White counsels from Australia this time, this land should be received, and she supports the idea of receiving this land grant for mission.
Our main mode of communication among all of us at the time was what we call today the Adventist Review.
Yes.
Is this where these letters are being sent and analyzed, or are these private letters that are going to everyone involved?
This particular debate, I think it is
just among church leaders.
Among church leaders.
Just church leaders.
Yes. And it is debated again among church leaders whether this should
last, because it takes months for letters to go back and forth.
Well, the point is that the land was received.
Okay.
And so the debate goes on.
The story ends well.
So Vessels takes the land.
He takes the land.
And then church leaders debate whether
it should be.
But he's already taken.
He's already taken the land.
All right.
Because the story is that the work begins. But unfortunately, and this also is another factor, there is a war that breaks out just on the arrival of the missionaries, because Vessels receives the land and he leaves and he goes back to South Africa, leaving Sparrow in charge of the farm development, and they're expecting missionaries to come. So I think the sending of missionaries does not take very long, which means the matter was settled probably because of the influence that Ellen White weighed into the matter.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, what's the war that you said? There's a war that breaks out. That's that's the British with the indigenous people, presumably.
Yes, this is the Matabele rebellion.
Right.
That breaks out, and so with this war, and this actually comes after the missionaries have just arrived, because Vessels leaves with some of the team, and he leaves only Sparrow, and so Sparrow goes to meet the new missionaries that have been assigned. And they come, and as they arrive at this new land, war breaks out. And so
So
soldiers,
this is an uprising of the local people
Yes,
who've been
against
dispossessed
perhaps,
against the Rhodesian government.
yes, they then begin. They get security escort to Solusi because they had the vessels and the team just built 3 huts, presumably mud huts.
And so Solusi, tell us what Solusi is, because we haven't covered that yet.
Solusi is the land where
That Jameson is given to vessels.
yes, that's right.
And so
The
they-
12,000 acre land that is given to.
So they go to a place called Solusi, and that's where they start their.
That's where they
work.
start the work. And so as they start the work, and vessels has left, and Sparrow meets the missionaries who come from America to start the work, and then war breaks out. So they are escorted to Bulawayo to find some help and shelter, and then they could not even afford hotel accommodation there. It was just too expensive because of the war. And so they put up in the wagons.
In their ox wagons.
In their ox wagons.
Wow.
So you have 4 families, the doctor, Carmichael, and you have other missionary families, including Sparrow, and they put up in the wagons. They share a wagon. Some, even W.H. Anderson with his family, were under the wagon.
Oh, wow.
Right. W.H. Anderson, by the way, becomes a legendary name in Adventist mission in Africa, and so he's one of the first party of missionaries that goes after they've acquired Solusi. Is that right?
Right. So times are difficult, challenging for the missionaries at this time because of the war, and it extends for months, and they are under shelter and waiting for a way to get back to their mission station. But for months they are stuck there, and there is a record that during their stay there, it was actually between 1896 and 1897, a whole year that this was going on. And Anderson and Sparrow take turns to go to the farm, Solusi, and it's a walk, 35-mile walk, and he has to get some supplies there that they can find. I don't know what they left, but probably some food or whatever they can find as supplies. So they go at night because they can't go during the day; it's too risky.
Wow.
And whoever goes, as they take turns, stays for a week, and then comes back walking because they can't afford to even travel with the means that they had then. So it was difficult and challenging times through the war that the missionaries went through. So one finds a
Did any of them
sacrifice. Not at this stage.
Okay.
They survive, and they're able to go back
And
after
start to put things in
and
place
start
in Solusi.
putting things in place at Solusi.
Right. So
And-
it's fascinating, the connections. This episode, we're seeing a lot of connections between Adventist history and wider history, especially British imperial history with the war. So they faced the danger of war, but didn't they also face the danger of disease?
Yes. And the first thing that actually happens is that as they return, there is disease on their cattle. Their cattle all die.
And of course, they
About
need
200 cattle.
they're setting what they're doing, and we should probably explain this for our listeners and viewers. They're not just setting up a mission station; they're setting up an agricultural concern,
Yes.
partly to sustain themselves, but partly also because Adventists like to teach people to be self-sufficient.
Right.
And this is where Adventists are departing from the colonial mindset. The British would like
good point.
would like the local people to be kept in subjection, but Adventists, wherever we go, train people
opposite.
in modern agricultural techniques. Partly because many of them are farmers from America, and they do it, but they don't just do it because they don't, this is what they do, and they don't know what else to do. They do it because they want to teach people to be self-sufficient. And they're going to teach them to read, they're going to teach them to write so that they can teach them the scriptures. And we've lost sight today of how of how subversive these activities are. If you're a colonial power, or if you're a local white landowner, or in somewhere like Peru where Ferdinand Stahl works, and we'll talk about him in a future episode, if you're the local landowners who are trying to oppress the Indians, for all of these people to teach indigenous people to read and write, to teach them agriculture, math, history, to teach them agricultural techniques so that they can be self-supporting, to teach them trades and techniques. This is deeply subversive stuff. Adventists, we like to think of ourselves, and we are in many ways, sort of small c conservatives, keeping out of trouble. But actually, Adventists, wherever we go, do things that in the light of secular powers would be seen as subversive.
This is where the colonial values and the missionaries' values did not align.
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. So
because there's development happening as you develop education, which was kind of the main thrust of our mission work.
Yeah.
People are developed in their understanding, and also in terms of skills.
Yeah.
They learn skills.
But so for this reason, to have all the cattle die is a big blow.
It is, because they were depending on these cattle and to actually even trade as they, as the collection of cattle grows. But now it's all gone. But the missionaries don't leave. They stay. And they continue trying to work the land and in the best possible ways. But again, another crisis hits. Now this time it is malaria.
Right.
And as malaria hits...
Something for which Westerners don't have a cure at that stage.
At that time. There were some medication options that were not so good. But, it was available. And so as this deadly scourge of malaria ravages through the land, the missionaries are infected, all of them. And unfortunately, many of them die. And today we have graves of those missionaries at Solusi University, which is a sign of sacrifice, of life, and also, mission work. And I really pause a moment here to really thank God for the tenacity, the passion that these missionaries had for God's work. They could have turned back and said, let's go home, it's over. We don't have a cure for this, but they remain, they stay, they continue. And we owe a lot to these missionaries who succumbed to malaria. Dr. A.S. Carmichael died in 1898. G.B. Tripp, a week later. His young son on April 2, 1898.
Yes, so it's George Tripp and George Tripp Jr. who dies a week later, and they're buried in graves in the same cemetery. You can still see that.
At Solusi.
Here's George B. Tripp Sr. and here's George B. Tripp Jr.
Yeah.
And it's on the same year.
Same year.
Just within a week.
Yes.
George Tripp Jr. dies a week later.
Yeah. And then we have others who go to South Africa to seek cure and help. And they also arrive at Kimberley, but they died there in
Because
Kimberley.
they were too ill.
They were too ill to survive.
Do you have their names as well?
Yes, you have Mrs. F.B. Armitage and F.L. Mead, who died 2.5 years later in Kimberley.
So we should acknowledge their sacrifice.
Yes.
And I think that's right to do so.
The work was challenging, dangerous, but the missionaries continue their work. Those, at least, that remain. W.H. Anderson. That's a big name in terms of continuing the work of mission, spreading even from Solusi further into other parts of Africa.
So to be an early missionary in Zimbabwe was dangerous.
It was a dangerous mission, yes.
Right. You could lose. You could very easily. A whole number of people lost their lives.
And what is interesting is that they were aware of the dangers. They saw it coming.
And they still went.
But they stayed and continued the mission work.
Which is humbling. But what was their impact?
The impact later on was really seen in the development of the work, which came slowly because they focused on developing the missions. So W.H. Anderson developed and helped develop the mission at Solusi, and then we moved on to Zambia, then the northern Rhodesia, and that's where he established another mission field. And again, there another story of how the land was given. They came to a chief or king, and the chief said, "How much land do you want?" They were not sure how much, and so he said, "Just take a walk, and that will be your land." Can you imagine?
So this time they negotiate with the indigenous ruler directly,
yes.
right? They're not seizing it through the British government.
Yeah, they are in,
For them to receive such land, they must have had some level of trust with these people. You don't just turn up to or write a letter and all of a sudden out of nowhere they say, "Absolutely, you take a walk, whatever your feet touch, that will be yours." I mean, that's of a biblical proportion story. Which actually, this reminds me about something. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul stays a little bit of time in each place, some places longer than others, but he quickly moves on. There are a few people worshiping.
He spends a few years in Corinth and Ephesus.
Ephesus 2 years, Corinth a couple of years. These missionaries are spending 1 year here, 2 years there. So it's in some weeks, some places he spends weeks and months, it seems.
yeah.
But it's not a decade. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It's not a long period of time and then he moves on.
Right.
The word seems to spread faster.
But he leaves people behind. He leaves people like Epaphroditus, Titus, Timothy, and they then stay there for years. Or even Luke in Philippi, who, in the book of Acts, Luke, you get the first person narrative Luke's talking about, and then it stops because Luke has stayed in Philippi. And it must be a good 5 or 6 years later that suddenly Luke starts writing in the first person again, because Paul has passed back through Philippi and picked him up. So, and I think where you're going with this, Sam, is that this is the key for the early missions in Africa. People don't just stay for a year; they go and invest long periods. They invest their lives, actually, their life's work into these missions in Solusi and other parts of what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia and Malawi.
Right.
But they also expand. They give their life to the mission work, but they go to, as Michael put it, to other parts from there. They go here and they go there, and that takes a certain level of trust in the people that you've just discipled.
Yes, I like what you're saying about trust, Sam, because the level of trust is also built because of the people that go with a missionary, because you have indigenous people who are part of the mission team.
Sure.
And they're going with the missionary, and they know the language, they know the people, and they begin to speak the same language. And this has weight because there are people that have embraced this truth and this message within this region. And therefore, there's a level of trust that is built, that these people can be trusted, especially when you look at the political situation at the time. That they're not coming in to, take away things, but they're coming here to
give,
to develop and to give.
Help.
And to help. Yes.
And so Adventists, the missionaries, learn the local languages and they adapt to the local culture.
Yeah.
So this is what today we would call contextualization,
Right.
which is sometimes seen as a recent thing, but actually it's there from an early stage.
And I appreciate what the Encyclopedia of Adventists has done in terms of bringing up these missionaries, indigenous missionaries, and citing their names and giving background to who they were.
Right.
That they were not just, people without background, but they were, people with names, and they contributed also in this. So this is a very important. The trust, I think, was built because of this partnership that was there.
And let's just
the locals.
Let's just tell you where you can find some of these stories. Michael mentioned the encyclopedia. It's the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, and it's available online at encyclopedia.adventist.org. That's encyclopedia.adventist.org. But those stories you're talking about, Michael, remind us the missionaries are crucial because they take the truth there, they take the third angel's message there, but the missionaries can't do all the work themselves. And we talked about this in a previous episode in West Africa, and it's the local indigenous people who become converted who actually start to really expand the work. Is that right?
That's right. Because it is these people who begin now to go out to communities, and churches are built, and also other missions are developed from Solusi as the first and base mission. So we have a lot of other missions developing from there. And W.H. Anderson played a very important role in developing mission work.
So he's not so much a church planter as a mission station planter.
Yes, exactly.
I was a pastor in London for 11 years, and I had the privilege of pastoring many Zimbabweans. In fact, there are thousands of Zimbabweans now in London, or in England altogether, in the United Kingdom. Clearly, their work has grown exponentially in the country of Zimbabwe.
Yes.
Just in Zambia, the proportion of Adventists in Zambia to the population is huge. The ratio is a very small ratio, which means there are many.
Zimbabwe too, it's like 8 or 9, maybe 10% in Zimbabwe and Zambia are Seventh-day Adventists, whereas most places 0.1% is good, and yet there it's 100-fold that, 9 or 10%.
Well, let me mention something about the way it started and how the trust was developed, because it did not start too good when you see Adventists coming in at a crisis like that, when colonialists are moving in,
right,
and Adventists also benefit and they move in. So one would think that this probably would have dented the growth of the church and the mission and the perspective people have.
The people
people have.
People wouldn't have trusted them.
Yes, but you see how Adventists build that trust through the work in education, health, and in many other areas of mission, where people begin to say, well, these people are here for us. They are developing us there. And so right now, in the Zimbabwe government, Adventists enjoy a very high regard by the government, to the extent that the education structure of the church is supported very highly by government.
Wow.
And so while this is not the ideal where even teachers are supported financially, but the Adventists are given latitude to practice as Adventists with no interference from government. So this is showing the level of trust that has been developed over the years that has really contributed to the growth of the church.
Praise the Lord.
But Sam, you were going to make a point about Zimbabweans outside Zimbabwe, I think.
Yes.
They are the Zimbabweans that have come to London, the Adventist ones. They're highly educated. They're very passionate about the mission of the church. They take the gospel very seriously, and I've had the privilege to pastor many of them. Do you think there is a new wave of missionaries that have received the gospel, kept it to a degree pure as much as they could, and are now being sent directly by God or because of circumstances to other parts of the world where the missionaries once came from, in order to inspire them once again? Do you see that parallel? Tell me more about that.
That's a very interesting perspective, Sam, because I see everywhere in Europe and even here in America a number of Zimbabwean churches. And also in the international churches, you find Zimbabweans everywhere. So which means they've become missionaries after receiving the message through the missionaries who came to Africa. Now they are missionaries like William Hunt was.
Right.
Where
we talked about
they are
last
working.
time.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are out working, but they are doing witnessing through in the workplace and whatever they're doing, but they are witnesses, and the church is growing that way.
That's absolutely beautiful. Michael, thank you for joining us in this podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it and that you'll come back again.
Certainly I did. And thank you so much for the work of bringing back these memories of mission work over the 150 years.
Yes. Well, thanks again for you joining us in this episode of Mission 150. Please keep watching on AdventistReview.tv, on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel, or listening on your favorite social platform or podcast platform as you see fit. If you have enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Now, maybe you want to know more about Adventist missionary work. Just go ahead and visit adventistmission.org. And if you want to find mission opportunities, go to vividfaith.com. Let me tell you just a little bit about Vivid Faith. If you are an Adventist organization, if you represent or work in an Adventist organization, and you can create mission opportunities, we have a huge problem right now. We have too many missionaries that want to go and not enough people calling them to work there. So if you can help with that ratio, create mission opportunities, people will find their way to you. Vividfaith.com is the place that you register. We'll be back next week with more on inspiring history of Adventist mission around the world.